war. Definitely hope those who are here listen to part one, and I would definitely advise you to listen to part one before you listen to this one, because the history that was laid down allows for today's conversation to be clear. So today we're going to get into the October 7th and everything since then. October 7th was the attack that Hamas launched, and how our two guests, both Rana and Musa, want to frame that, as well as some of the anti-solidarity myths that are floating around that lead to a reason to basically just sit this one out, because, I don't know, Palestinian people have flaws. So because they have flaws and they have contradictions like all the rest of us have, I guess that's just a reason to, not support them. I'm being sarcastic for those who can't follow. I do want to read the numbers of the death toll since, because this is my point in the first episode, and I'm recording all of this within the same week. So these are not, just to give you a sense of how much this keeps ratcheting up. So the death toll currently, as of now, is in Gaza, 6,546 people have been killed. About 7,439 have been wounded, and in the occupied West Bank, 104 have been killed. 1,734 have been wounded, and then there's also been about 1,400 arrests. But we shouldn't really understand those as arrests. We should understand those people as hostages too, because often they're arrested for ultimately nothing. And many of these are, women and children. But regardless of who they are, women, children, men, it doesn't matter. Like, Israel's holding hostages too. Thousands of people inside the prisons for doing virtually nothing, or throwing rocks or whatever. Israel's toll has not really went up since. It's still at 1,400 and about 5,000 and a half wounded. Again, we're not brushing off the deaths or wounds of anyone here, but you just show that this keeps ratcheting up. Within the day, recording this late, but within the day, it says about 700, the Gaza Ministry of Health announced about 700 people have been killed in the last 24 hours. There was like 47 massacres targeting families and homes within the Gaza Strip. And overall, the UN says about 1.4 million Palestinians have been displaced from their homes. And again, this episode will age out. At least the numbers we present here will age out, and we don't know how this is going to get. It's easily, unfortunately, again, I don't shrug these things off, it's probably going to get to at least 10,000 and just keep going. And so much so to the point that now you have Joe Biden and others saying that, they don't know if these numbers are reliable. And you got to accept the fact that civilians die because it's war.
What they say to me is I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. I'm sure innocents have been killed, and it's the price of waging a war. I think we should be incredibly careful. I think not we, the Israelis should be incredibly careful to be sure that they're focusing on going after the folks that are propagating this war against Israel. And it's against their interest when that doesn't happen. But I have no confidence in the number that the Palestinians are using.
This is war. It is combat. It is bloody. It is ugly, and it's going to be messy. And innocent civilians are going to be hurt going forward. I wish I could tell you something different.
And we do accept that this is a war, not the way they framed it, between Israel and Hamas, but a war between Israel, the West, the United States, all of these imperialist powers versus the Palestinian people. That's the war that's currently going on. But now they're just pushing this idea, okay, we're going to let these people die. It just is what it is, and people are just going to have to accept it. And it's justified. So as they're saying that, they're releasing all these stories about how terrible Hamas is to justify it. Because even if you hate Hamas, none of this is justifiable, regardless. So that's why we just say we're not getting into that. So anyway, I want to let the guests talk. I don't want to ramble any further. So that's all I'm going to say. So we pick up right at October 7th. asking Rana and Musa how they would like to frame that, how we should understand that, considering the history that's been laid down. So when we come to what happened on October 7th, and I keep saying what happened, but like, how should we first, just if either one of y'all could actually just describe that, because I think it's interesting to hear y'all actually explain that day, however you see it, because even the way that gets framed after everything we've said and the way the media describes it today, the mainstream media completely negates anything y'all have said over the last hour or so. So like, how should we understand, like, what would y'all describe October 7th as? It doesn't have, however you would describe it, then how should we try to understand October 7th and further on to this very moment?
I think for a lot of Palestinians, it was people in Gaza breaking out of a prison in mass. And immediately a lot of people were speaking about the prison break that happened a couple years ago, where 6 Palestinian prisoners broke out of one of the most militarized prisons, Israeli prisons, and they were out for a few weeks, I believe. They came out, there was like a few interviews that we got, that we heard from them, but a lot of people thought that they were immediately like in touch with someone, like some movements that hid them and would smuggle them somewhere. But no, they actually didn't even ask anyone for help. They didn't go to anyone. They didn't want to risk anyone else getting, involved in the punishment that would inevitably face them. And one of them said, we did this just because we wanted to show the world that their prison is nothing but a pile of dust or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but it feels like a very similar sentiment. I'm sure that the resistance factions in Gaza knew that they wouldn't be able to take over all of Israel in this one attack, but they did know that they would be able to probably do the biggest attack that Israel had seen in a long time, the first time that they might have experienced some amount of the violence that they've been inflicting on Palestinians with complete impunity for decades now. And I think for a lot of people who are living in these open-air prisons, there was a sense of dignity restored in that moment, before the horror that followed it. There was a sense that, people need to fight back. It's just part of the human condition to not fight back when you're attacked. It destroys the spirit, the soul, and living in this very neoliberal world that completely disguises the power structures that exist. We've talked a lot about gaslighting. It's like not even a strong enough word for what is happening. But yeah, I think that it was a moment that, people saw it as a prison break. I'll just say that.
Yeah, I think a prison break is the excellent way to describe it, because as we said earlier, these are people fighting from the largest open air prison in the world. I guess for people who might be unfamiliar or who only have the sort of CNN mainstream narrative,
The terrorist attack. That's
the terrorist attack, right?
Yeah.
People can search my name, the word terrorism. I've written a lot about why I don't even like to use that term at all, ever. But and even transparently, this is a minefield of a conversation to talk about. Because in 2 weeks, we've seen dozens of people lose their jobs, be doxxed, attacked, lies and slander spread about them.
Banned from YouTube, banned platforms,
banned from platform, deplatformed. We've had law professors write open letters saying, do not hire any of my students because they were pro-Palestinian, right? So, I just am transparent with your listeners who are watching and listening to this. Like, this is a minefield of a conversation to have, simply because the repression is so strong. Even parsing to like state the facts is a bit intimidating. But on October 7th, I even have to back up because I think people might not know that the Hamas is not just some group of insurgents. They're the political representation of Gaza, essentially, is
Right.
Political organization. They run some of the schools, hospitals, etc. And so, it's not just random militant fighters. This is like, there's an entire history of their emergence and their demands in recent years, forming various coalitions with other resistance groups. But they launched what was called Operation Al-Aqsa. And this is essentially a liberation war to break free from the prison and to initiate what they see and many hope as a process to free Palestine. This include rocket barrages, various attacks. And in the sort of initial hours or even days after this unfolded on October 7th, where you had a couple hundred Israelis die, you had these incredibly polarizing statements that were being put forth by like CNN anchors and stuff, saying that they ran into Israel and beheaded 40 babies, right?
Yep.
That I think is probably the biggest myth that is like still with people, even though it has been thoroughly debunked, is like these savage Muslims.
President Biden actually repeated that and said,
I never really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children. I never thought I'd ever. Anyway.
that and said he saw images of it. He didn't just say it happened. He said he saw images. But continue. I just want to get that on record.
Yeah. He said images, and then the next day, once it starts being debunked, the press secretary has to double back and say, well, he just meant he heard about it, So we have that. There was accusations of mass rapes taking place, and there were decontextualized videos that were, again, later debunked, right? But by them launching this resistance and liberation struggle, armed struggle, the armed faction of Hamas, because again, it's a massive organization, it gave Israel an excuse to say, okay, genocide, to put it bluntly.
Killing of innocents and civilians was,
So what you have is the 24 hours following the morning of October 7th, you have national headlines trending, quote unquote, innocent civilian Israelis slaughtered, 40 babies beheaded, mass rape of women, which also consider that this is, Hamas is an Islamic group, and we have like, as a Muslim, we have values of fighting and war that we very, very strongly do not go against as well. And so some of the things are just flat out wrong on their head when you hear them, but to a foreigner who knows nothing about Islam, nothing about Palestine, especially nothing about Gaza or Hamas, they hear these things and they think of these Muslim savages and they run with it. So the world is mourning for the, Israeli children and innocent civilians, which just 2 days ago, the Times of Israel, which is the paper of note in Israel, published stating that there were in fact no minors who were killed in the initial attack on October 7th. So again, we have the number of lies we're up to at this point is enough to fill entire volumes of libraries. Turn around and you have, as Rana said earlier, a population in Gaza that's 50% youth, 50% under the age 18, and you have within a 6-day period the equivalent of roughly 45 to 50 missile airstrikes every hour taking place for 6 days straight. I don't think people who've never been near a war zone can even fathom one rocket airstrike. But then to have a people who, as we said earlier, are quite literally trapped in this place, like they're not allowed to leave. So in the first 48 hours, Israel tells them to, and Rana, correct me if I'm wrong, evacuate to the south. The south will be the safe place. We've opened a humanitarian corridor. There's one route, one specific route. You're able, all 2.2 million of you are somehow going to get down to the south, and we won't bomb you. Then as they're on their way on the one corridor they have, Israel bombs the corridor to the south, right? This is like, if you are allegedly so distraught about this liberation struggle that's being waged against you because innocent people and innocent lives are lost, you turn around and give it tenfold to a people who already have been locked inside a cage, have been denied basic necessities. I was recently looking at rates of like infant mortality being through the roof, denial and lack of medicine in the hospital. Like, so this is already the condition of these people. Then you tell them to evacuate because you're going to indiscriminately bomb, meaning like every building that you can, you're just going for it and claiming and justifying and saying it's because you're trying to get at Hamas. And I saw the video of a Palestinian speaking on an interview with BBC, and she said, you know, Hamas is not just some random group of fighters. They're the elected officials in Gaza. No matter how you feel about them, how do you plan to, quote unquote, exterminate them, right? Because you also have Israeli politicians and defense ministers calling Palestinians roaches and rats that need to be exterminated.
Human animals.
Human.
I have ordered a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no fuel, no water. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we will act accordingly.
Human animals, savages, like think of the most racist language you can think of, and this is how they're describing this operation they're launching in response. And so now you have these millions of people trapped in this open-air prison, and you have the colonizer dropping thousands, like in the thousands of bombs on their heads every minute, every hour. You know, that is how I would explain the events of October 7th and how we got to where we are currently, where I think now the number is over like 4,500 Palestinians have been killed. Around half of those being children. Again, you have the world, the entire world stands with Israeli children. It stands with the children. Yet the Palestinian children. And by the way, that number does not include those who are trapped in rubble, who might never get counted, whose names we probably will never know, right? So the hypocrisy is astounding. And then the last thing I'll say, in the immediate aftermath of the October 7th events and the launching of the Aqsa operation, you had the president of the U.S. going on national television and giving full, unfiltered, unadulterated support of Israel and their actions as they begin their bombing campaign.
The fact is that Israel, as they respond to these attacks, it seems to me that have to continue to ensure that you have what you need to defend yourselves. And we're going to make sure that occurs, as you know. And we have to also bear in mind that Hamas does not represent all the Palestinian people.
Which incites nationally anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian rhetoric. We saw a 6-year-old boy, Palestinian boy, I think maybe in Chicago or Detroit.
It was in it was outside
Illinois.
Chicago. Yeah.
Stabbed and killed. I think stabbed like, and a dozen times or something like that, right?
By his
So like
landlord. Yeah.
by his landlord, who had previously, been a friend of the family and was radicalized because this anti-Palestinian rhetoric is that's emanating from Israel is so fucking powerful that people across the world are hearing it and being radicalized and just hating Palestinians and hating a group of people that they literally know nothing about. So I talked a lot, but that's how I would describe these events. I think saying it was like breaking from a prison.
Yeah.
I could only imagine the empowerment. You know, like I think of Jonathan Jackson trying to take over the courthouse to free his brother, George Jackson. Or I think of these kind of moments in like Black history where we are resistant and we are militant. And I think of how empowered I feel when knowing the conditions that we have been subjugated to, when you see those moments where you feel like you are breaking from that prison, even if momentarily. And I can only imagine Palestinians in Gaza, aside from the images of them quite literally breaking from, breaking through various fences and prisons and whatnot. I imagine that despite the difficulties, it was a liberating moment or the beginning of like a liberatory process.
The like dehumanizing process that led up to this was so real, and like kind of just stuck with me while you were talking, because so I was at a big protest today in Ottawa, capital city. It was the other Canadian state. There was maybe up to 10,000 people. It was the biggest one I've seen in my life. But every Palestinian I was running into was saying, "Don't you wish you were back home?" Like, people feel like they can't say that to folks here. Everyone is messaging me being like, "We're so glad you're here." And my mom is in Bethlehem. A lot of Canadian youth interviewed her under this kind of framing that she's stranded in Bethlehem because they weren't evacuating Palestinian Canadians as quickly as non-Palestinian Canadians who were in the region because we can't take the airport, etc. But she was like, "No, I'm not trying to leave." Like, she's like, if you understand how bad it is that you think that I should be running, how does that make it okay? Like,
right.
You want me to leave my students, leave my family, leave my friends, and just say, "Okay, good luck, and I'll go to this other place where I'll be safe because I have a second citizenship,
right?
That affords me certain rights." Like, it's so bewildering that we can talk really like plainly like this on the media, just completely like dismissing that the lives that exist there also deserve to be safe. I think one of the kind of myths or narratives that I heard a lot in the first couple of days that I think really set the stage for the genocide that would happen is a lot of folks were comparing the resistance attacks to the Holocaust. And they were saying this is the largest attack on Jews we've seen since the Holocaust. So
on October 7th, Hamas murdered 1,400 Israelis, maybe more. This is in a country of fewer than 10 million people. This would be equivalent to over 50,000 Americans murdered in a single day. That's 29 11s. That is why October 7th is another day that will live in infamy. Mr. President, you rightly said that Hamas is worse than ISIS. The German chancellor who visited here yesterday said that Hamas were the new Nazis. You're both right. And
it really paints this image of Palestinians that then legitimizes the bloodbath. But there's this enormous myth that Hamas is just this Muslim terrorist organization. Their mandate is to kill Jews. And I really don't think Hamas gives a shit if Israel is Jewish or any, it's Jewish or any other, or any other religion. Like, if the self-proclaimed Jewish state was a Muslim state, I think Hamas would still be an organization that wants to fight against their oppressor, regardless of who they are. And, they're a Muslim group in the sense that they have a Muslim ideology that believes that liberating Palestine is a Muslim duty or a religious duty. but there's this, that you spoke about why you don't like to use the word terrorist. These words are so loaded in the Western imaginary that it's almost impossible to speak about them frankly for what they are. But absolutely, like, Hamas doesn't care what religion the Israelis are. Hamas cares that they are part of the Gaza Strip, that they have been kept under siege, that they have absolutely no freedom, that they have no prospect of any future for them or any of their children. And there's a lot of legitimate critiques you can make of Hamas. There's so many. I mean, they're a political party. They have power. Anyone with power, you're going to find a lot of problems. They're part of a system that is patriarchal, that is replicating a lot of other power structures, whatever. But this is really not the time to bring in critiques, in my opinion, because all of it is being used to justify a genocide. Yeah. If you look at every single Palestinian statement that has come out over the past few weeks, nobody's condemning Hamas, which is just like common sense in my mind, because Palestinians understand that there was a legitimate right under international legal law for resistance, but also that for all the condemnation you might have, like, there was a clear effort to dehumanize these people so that they could wipe them up. And we all saw it coming. There was the first week felt like losing your mind, because it felt like you're yelling at a wall. You're saying like all these things that you guys are saying and all this knowledge that you guys are producing is paving the path to a bloodbath. Everyone was like, every Palestinian, all of our supporters were saying this. And yet, none of us are surprised that the American government took the stance that they did, of course. But so many progressives took this stance as well, and also participated in this rhetoric. So many academics and cultural institutions and all these, organizations and academics and thinkers who give land acknowledgements at the beginning of all of their events, who, joined us in the street for anti-racism protests, who, in theory, like, maybe many of them have built careers on decolonial theory. And
yep.
Where are they now?
Talk about it. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's so easy for us to look at the Haitian slave revolution revolt and understand, in theory, we support this. We understand how important this was in history. And then in the contemporary, there's zero understanding of this. And actually there isn't, because we saw over the last few years in the case of Ukraine that everyone does actually understand that a violent military occupation should be met or can be met with military resistance. So actually we do know that they do understand it, but not in the case of some people.
It's selective. And I think one of the narratives you mentioned, Black, that Netanyahu was calling this Israel's 9/11. Mm-hmm. And for anyone who knows even a cursory history of 9/11 and what 9/11 meant to countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, right? And the natives, the locals there. 2, what it meant for Muslims or Muslim passing, I don't know, there was Muslim adjacent people in not just the US, but in Canada as well, and across the UK. Calling it Israel's 9/11 is so tactical, because 9/11 gave the US the justification to completely wipe out, slaughter, brutalize, maim, incarcerate. I mean, we still to this day have a Guantanamo Bay, where we routinely just torture detainees. And so to me, that was such a dog whistle when you say something like that, because when you say the term 9/11, you're building on what now 20 plus years of Islamophobic racism and propaganda and rhetoric that was used to justify one of the most expensive and longest wars in history. And so he very tactically is saying this because he wants people in the West to hear that and to connect any instance of Palestinian resistance whatsoever. But he wants that to be connected with the same kind of violence that comes to mind when you think of 9/11. And the dehumanization is already in and of itself disgusting, but the fact that Israeli officials, obviously Israeli occupation forces, settlers, Western journalists, Western academics, all of these people are sitting at the table together, shaking hands, and are not only dehumanizing Palestinians and Muslims, but they're dehumanizing a people who are under collective punishment. They're dehumanizing the people who are now, since October 7th, experiencing Israel cutting off their water, not allowing food and aid to enter, cutting off electricity in some areas, cutting off gas supplies, cutting off internet, allegedly in some areas. So like, it's not just that you're dehumanizing these people, you're dehumanizing a people who are being bombarded and genocided, who have nowhere to go. So you're dehumanizing the people who are already, who have no choice but to resist. And so it's almost like this notion of victimhood just can't apply to Palestinians, right? Like they're, like you said earlier, when they go to the UN, protest peacefully, they do grassroots organizing, all of this. And so the way I view October 7th is like, there's a monopoly on violence.
Mm-hmm.
This Operation Al-Aqsa shifted that monopoly and was like, we want to remind you that by any means necessary means by any means necessary. And we too have certain tools in our tool belt. And I think in order to combat that becoming the popular narrative, you have to dehumanize the way that we've seen them dehumanize. I saw today a video of I think it was a BBC reporter who was interviewing a Palestinian. And the very first question she asked, of course, is, do you denounce Hamas? Because that's like the script, that's the playbook.
Every time.
And the Palestinian woman responds and says, like, a dozen of my family, I just got a call on the way to the studio that my cousin was killed. A dozen of my family members are dead, and another dozen who I have not spoken to and can't get in contact with because there's no electricity. The reporter responds with a grin on her face and says, so I will take that as you won't condemn Hamas. Didn't even register what she just said, that massive portions of her family have been killed. Quite literally responds with cold callousness, a grin on her face, like she had a gotcha moment or something like that. Like, this is what Palestinians are dealing with. And I don't even think we'll fully grapple with like just the level of sheer lack of morals and ethics that the West is presenting until this is said and done, and we do have a liberated Palestine and Palestinians are able to tell this history like Rana is doing right now. Because, or just when you think the West can't get any lower, they're like, oh, hold my beer. Let me hit this Congo line real quick. Let me scrub my back on the floor. You know what I mean? And so, and the numbers are astounding. Like, we keep on throwing out 4,500-ish people have been killed. I also read today the number of people now in Israeli prisons, Palestinians in Israeli prisons, has now doubled in 2 weeks, from around 5,000 to now over 10,000 and counting. All right. And that's not even just from like Gaza. That's quite literally, that's from like in the West Bank. There's been 91 Palestinians killed in the West Bank, and that's not even, Hamas isn't even in the West Bank. Right.
Said a lot of these are teenagers. Again, I don't like to make those distinctions very often because it gets into this appeal to some kind of innocence or whatever. But these are like young, like a lot of these young boys that are in prison for throwing a rock. Yeah.
Well, and that's the other point. I posed a question on Twitter and did not think that the tweet would get the traction it got. And I'm like, My mentions are in shambles right now with like Israeli flags, which like, it happens. But there's so much talk about hostages and that Hamas has taken Israeli hostages as bargaining, as leverage. No one is talking about the fact that even prior to October 7th, Israel had hundreds of Palestinian children detained, hundreds of Palestinian children, hundreds of Palestinian political prisoners like Walid Daqqa, who there's been a global movement to free him. Is it not hostages when you are taking Palestinian prisoners for the explicit purpose of essentially getting intel on potential resistance, to divide, to disrupt their families, to disrupt their civil society, or arresting 12-year-olds for something as little as throwing a rock at the colonizer with an AK-47 on their corner? Are those not hostages? It's another one of those narratives that we're running with. And I'm like, I actually think it's Israel that needs to release the hostages. And now that number has gone up to 10,000. Why don't we release 10,000 hostages? And then we can talk. And so
everybody's a hostage out of this situation,
And that was my next point. The way it's being talked about is as if the people in the concentration camp are not hostages themselves. You have to actually, it's like both of you have said, it's so simple and clear cut. You actually have to do more mental gymnastics to try to even justify Israel's position at this point. It's actually harder to understand why they're killing innocent Palestinians if it's for nothing else than sheer colonization and violence.
It's so simple and uncut for me that it makes me feel crazy when it's not like that for other people. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's how much because it's just like looking at something that we all can observe very clearly, and then somebody's telling me it's not the color that it is, or something. That's how ridiculous it feels. But go ahead. I think you were about to say something, Rana. Go ahead.
Just that before October 7th, the number of administrative detainees was at an all-time high we hadn't seen in 20 years. Administrative detainees are Palestinian prisoners who are held by Israel without a charge or a trial, and this can be indefinite. It's between 1 and 6 month sentences that get renewed indefinitely. And even just that, is already kind of a mental punishment, because every few months these prisoners go before a review board that either says you're going back to prison or you're being released. So there's, imagine people who are held as administrative detainees for 7 years, and every few months they're taken before a board and they don't know if they're going to be free or not. So already that by itself is a whole issue. But then the thousands of other prisoners who are not administrative detainees are, every Palestinian, West Bank and Gaza, is tried in military court, Israeli military courts. They have a very low threshold for evidence. The word of a soldier is considered concrete evidence. The last time we got stats, we knew that it was a 99-point-something% conviction rate. So whether you're getting a trial or you're not getting a trial, like an administrative detainee, you're not getting any kind of thing resembling justice. We can talk more, starkly about how all prisons are not just and all trials are probably not just.
Right.
But there is a distinction with military courts. Like, you see it in the West Bank because a Palestinian and an Israeli can live next to each other in the West Bank. A settlement sometimes is, 5 minutes away from you, like right beside your village. And an Israeli kid and a Palestinian kid will go to court. They won't go to the same court. An Israeli kid will be treated like a kid in a court. A Palestinian as young as 12 can go to prison, can be charged for years. Palestinian children can serve prison time just without any physical evidence, just based on something a soldier says. And we see so many cases like this. And another thing that marks Palestinian prisoners is long sentences. There's hundreds of prisoners who have decades-long sentences.
And also, not to mention too, just to add, the vast majority of children who come through this prison system do not speak Hebrew. They speak Arabic, but the officials speak to them in Hebrew as an intimidation factor and often refuse to speak to them in their native language. And we also have reports from neutral international bodies of mass torture, sexual violence, abuse. And so you just put yourself in, like, I got chills just thinking about being a child and people speaking a foreign language around you while you're being abused and tortured. But I just wanted to add that context. Sorry, continue.
There's also over 95% instance of ill treatment or torture for every single prisoner who's held by Israel. There's constant collective punishment. Prison raids are something that we see regularly, and sometimes they're implemented just to boost the morale of the Israeli soldiers. Sometimes it's just a training exercise for them, but they are these horrific like military incursions on prisoners who are already locked up. Like, it's really unfathomable. And so to think of them as anything other than hostages just blows my mind. They're kidnapped from their families. They're held. Israel regularly, and I mean every week, does things to place pressure on prisoners who are under interrogation. This is completely regular behavior. They will do things like arrest family members of prisoners and then say, look, we've held your sister, so now you have to confess. Torture is legal as a tool under interrogation in Israel, and information extracted through torture is legal in the court. So one of the most effective things that they can do if they're not successful just physically torturing the prisoner is hurt their family members. And this happens regularly, demolish their house as a way to pressure them, raid their house, say that, they use a lot of gender violence, arresting women as a way to put pressure on men, saying that we have your sister in custody. You don't know what we're going to do to her if you don't speak, or forcing them to demolish their own house. Because when they demolish houses, they send a bill. They send a bill to the people whose home they've demolished, and sometimes it's cheaper to demolish your own home. This is also regular across the West Bank, whether it's used punitively as we're talking about, or what's more often the case is that Palestinians are not able to get building permits from Israel. In so many areas, you're not allowed to build unless you get a building permit. And they're given at pretty much impossible rates. In many places, it's impossible to get a building permit. This is why you see Palestinian families build upwards in a lot of regions. Like, you see new additions to the top of the house because they can't expand onto their own land. Wow. So yeah.
One of the things I'm thinking about as I hear you, Rana, describe these conditions, and these are things that I know about, but to hear you as someone from the Palestinian community and having firsthand experience, it hits so much different. You know what I mean? The power of narrative is so strong when it's in the hands of the people who are fighting the liberation struggle. And I remember an extremely eye-opening moment was when I spoke with a queer Palestinian a few years ago, and he was telling me about how Israel blackmails queer Palestinians. In the past, since October 7th, I've seen this line online a lot used to try to break solidarity with Palestine that Black people have, or really anyone around the world. And they say things like, oh, Palestinians hate gay people. You would be stoned. Hamas would stone you. Why are you supporting Palestinians? They hate the gays. And it's so bizarre. And it gets you to this, concept of pinkwashing. This idea that Israel is some big bastion of gay rights, and they're in a sea of savages who all want to just bloody murder all the gays. And it's like, in reality, one, it's just not true, right? Gays and Israeli gays themselves will tell you life is extremely not easy for them there in Israel outside of one or two tourist areas. But Israel also has a very long history of actually blackmailing and sort of using homophobia as a tool against Palestinians. One of the famous trends or patterns that the Israeli occupation forces do in order to force people to become informants for them, for example, is say you go through a checkpoint or something like that, and they go through your phone, and they learn that you're, a gay man or something like that. And they tell you, if you don't become an informant for us, we're going to tell your whole family. Or, if you don't do this, we're going to out you. And they hold that over Palestinians' heads. But the flip side of that is that for gays in the West, speaking to my gay family right now, for you to think that your arbitrary Western notion of quote unquote gay rights is what decides whether people on the receiving end of genocide and colonization should get our support or not is the most disgusting imperialist logic possible. Because for a people, if I were to put myself in the shoes of a gay Palestinian in this moment, again, roughly 45 to 50 bombs per hour from Israel, if you're hungry, you have no food, running water, electricity, and you're sheltering underneath rubble of bombed homes, the last thing you're probably worried about is gay rights. The last thing you're probably worried about when you don't know where your next meal is going to come from or if a bomb is going to drop on your head, the last thing you're worried about is whether you can get gay married or not, right? And so I want people to really think about these narratives that they say in order to try to break our solidarity with Palestine. And it also assumes that here in the US, where these people are saying this, that we have some beautiful gay right utopia, when we know that there's there's trans people and there's gay people who are killed at nearly genocidal levels already as is. And so when I keep seeing this line about, oh, Palestinians hate gay people, how would you be in solidarity? It's like, you want to hold social progress over the heads of the people who have been in occupation and who have been strangled for 75 years. Do you think that the conditions of occupation and colonization are good for having a gay pride march or trying to force LGBTQ rights, this Western notion, into society? Do you think that you're able to talk about these different things when you are not allowed to travel to the city next to you because you got to go through checkpoints, or because you have a Palestinian ID, you can't, there's more important things to someone who is under occupation than your small view of what gay rights might mean to you. And so as we have seen the October 7th events unfold, and there's been this massive unpouring of solidarity from around the world, there's also now all these new narratives that they're trying to use to break solidarity. And there's all these anti-solidarity narratives that Israelis and Zionists and people in the US are putting forth. And this is one that for me in particular is just it feels so especially despicable. You know what I mean? I don't know if I'm making sense, but it just feels especially disgusting to me.
I think there's definitely something to say about how cis heteropatriarchy and white supremacy are these systems that exist everywhere in the world. But there's often this narrative that the West is above it and condemns the rest of the world as being backwards for being anti-queer or something like that, even though we know that these are global systems, that anti-queer and anti-trans violence happens here in the West as well, as does white supremacist violence. And for Palestinian queers, they're still going through checkpoints. They're still having their homes demolished. They're still being arrested. So for people to say that they're safe in Israel is just bewildering, because who is safe? Like, I guess you're safe if you're a Jewish queer person in Israel, but the apartheid system still, it does not accept queer Palestinians. So it's really bewildering. I had someone say that to me. I did a podcast a few months ago, and the whole podcast was good. And then at the end, one of the interviewers who hadn't spoken much was like, we have to admit, it's a safe haven. It's a complete safe haven for queers. And that's what's so valuable about Israel. And I was really bewildered because it was like we hadn't spoken for an hour. It was really bewildering, but these things really persist, and they're really related to dehumanization as well, because there's this that like only liberal, liberated, non-savage minds are post like homophobia and phobia, and all these people in the global south are really barbaric and they don't understand our values, and so it has this like very intense dehumanizing aspect to it as well.
You talked about the, anti, LGBTQI plus QAI plus narrative that's out there, but there's also, this, I guess that Palestinians are anti-black, or they're racist. That they're racist. That and that. So why support them if they're racist? And I think the way people will put it, they would kill you too, or they don't like you anyway, or they wouldn't struggle for you, or when the police kill you, they don't say nothing. I mean, these usually come from people who don't do anything for black people, even when black people are saying it. But there's that narrative that, well, why should we support them? They ain't never done this is most famously was repeated by Dr. Umar Johnson, who posted that on his page. So we're not pulling this from nowhere. So would you like to speak to that, or both of you speak to that, and then we can kind of, wrap this up.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, if there is any other group, any other like ethnic group in the world who has given as much solidarity to black people outside of like black people or any non-black, it is Palestinians, because very few people can understand our plight the way that Palestinians can, first off. And I think that to say that is not to diminish what black people and Africans have gone through and what we currently are still going through in many places, but it's to say that, well, first off, solidarity is not transactional, right? Like, you don't lend solidarity to a people who are engaging in a liberation struggle, or to a people who are being genocided because you want something in return, first off. Like, I think that, this logic of capitalism, we view everything as an investment, everything, whether we realize it or not. So we're like, why would I give solidarity to someone all the way in the Middle East? And what does that do for me? And they've never done anything for me. When has solidarity ever been about getting something in return? But the other part is we do get a lot in return, right? Like a free Palestine is a net positive for the whole entire world, but especially for black people, because it just opens up one more horizon of opportunity for our own liberation struggle. Viewing solidarity as transactional replicates oppressive power dynamics. No one should have to earn your solidarity, just like no one should have to earn their human right or earn the ability to not be genocided. Mm-hmm. Right? The third point is that, and this is really, I mean, I know we talked about all kinds of other stuff on the podcast. This is actually my area of research, but the history of Black and Palestinian solidarity is long and is rich. And if everyone from Kwame Ture to Malcolm X to Angela Davis to Assata Shakur to everyone in between has made these connections and has stood very firmly with the Palestinians, to the point where some Pan-Africanists, like myself, consider the Palestinian struggle a Pan-African struggle. If there's this large history, why would we try to now, in this moment, when there's a genocide unfolding, go against that history and try to rewrite it, or, write ourselves out of this long legacy of solidarity? Obviously, and to be completely frank, I'm tired of this narrative, Palestinians help people in Ferguson learn how to deal with tear gas. Yes, that's true, and that's amazing, and that's a moment in history we should never forget. But Palestinians, also welcomed Black Panthers in the 70s who were seeking refuge from the COINTELPRO murderous program of the U.S. government. They also, brought people like Huey P. Newton and Angela Davis on tours of their refugee camps, and they met with Palestinian liberation fighters to learn the tactics that they were planning and using and figure out how they could apply that to Black American struggle. When George Jackson was found murdered in his jail cell, he had poems from Palestinian poets that were on the floor of his jail cell, right? So this is something that an instance of interpersonal anti-Blackness, a term I don't often use.
Right.
It's not, an instance of a horizontal or interpersonal anti-Blackness does not justify you telling a certain people they must earn their solidarity from you and that they must earn the right to not be genocided. And that kind of logic is it's very disgusting. That's like direct from the oppressor. Of course we can talk about, anti-Black or anti-African racism among Arabs and Palestinians, sure. But is this the moment? Like, as we just described for an hour and a half, that Palestinians are facing a genocide? Like, this is why are we bringing this up now? You know what I mean? And then the last thing I'll say is, like, every Black person I've spoken with who's been to Palestine has said the same thing. Palestinians thanked me for coming. They thanked me for seeing with my own eyes their experiences. They painted pictures of Mike Brown and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor on the walls in Palestine. They revere people like Angela Davis, and Beverly Guy Sheftall, and famous Black people who support their cause, and they equally. And then the last thing is, whenever we are uprising and we're revolting, Africans in the U.S., have you ever read the statements that Palestinian organizations put out in solidarity with us? They're a lot more in-depth and sophisticated and heartfelt than you get from the typical run-of-the-mill Instagram posts. You know what I'm saying? And so this logic of like, oh, they hate Black people. I want people to, one, ask where they even got this idea from, that like there's just this arbitrary hatred of Black people operating among Palestinians, that they have the time in their day trying to figure out how to survive, that they have the time of day to like stop and hate you real quick, is even in itself a little bizarre. I'll stop there. I could probably talk about this for a long time, but yeah. I don't know if Rana or Black, y'all had something you wanted to add, but that's my thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, as someone who lives as a settler in the state Canada that was built on Indigenous and Black life, there is a really profound responsibility to show up for Black liberation, Indigenous liberation. And at the same time, like, I could never deny that there's anti-Blackness in Palestine and in the entire world, and white supremacy. And I would never argue with someone who had that experience. And just as I said, there's like a fear of talking about the Palestinian Authority because it makes things complicated. I think that there is a fear of talking about things like this because people worry that it will end in like a severing of solidarity ties. Right. And I think other senses that these things can help us build solidarity, and embracing complexity can help us dismantle like the colonial ways that we think things that's really black and white. And I do think that there is a very natural allyship that comes out when we get past these systems that divide us, and anti-Blackness is one of those systems. There is a really natural allyship that relates to, shared things in our histories and our experiences contemporarily. And just like anecdotally, when I was in Palestine a couple of years ago and the George Floyd protests were going on, that was one of the, it's rare that what's going on inside the US or Canada makes it to international news and makes it to Palestine. But that was one of those instances, and people were cheering them on because it just makes sense. I mean, it's really difficult to not see the ties, and yeah, I would just say there's like a natural allyship when we can get into it. And a lot of the time, like I can speak on behalf of Palestinians, a lot of Palestinians growing up in white supremacist states like this one look to white people for allyship, for validation of the cause. Look to northern states for validation of the cause, when most of the global south, in terms of states, has already voiced their support for Palestine, when most of the like marginalized people in the global north have already, shown support for Palestine. And so this is another part of breaking down that white supremacy is recognizing who our allies are and building that kinship, because I think together we are much stronger than when we try and appeal to the white liberal politics and try and we water down our own politics to get them on board. And that's a whole other. I will open another topic. We're also.
I will
be here. I think it's just real quick. I think what you said, Rana, earlier about the fragmentation, when you were breaking down the West Bank or just breaking down the way that Palestinians are fragmented. I think that's just true across all colonial, all throughout the entire colonial map of how things break down. It has different conditions and specific ways it's applied, but I think there's a certain fragmenting of groups who are oppressed by different colonizers to not really, find common ground. Like that's obviously done on purpose. So it's not an accident that these kind of narratives get thrown out. It's not to say that there are internal issues that every group has. Like, it's not to say that, there isn't any hatred of Black people or dislike of Black people or bigotry or anything like that. But it's interesting how those fragments get used all the time, to divide, to break things up. We see this thrown out every time. So it's like, this isn't an average conversation that we have. But then when people are being bombed now, I'm supposed to care about, that issue when people are being bombed. I don't really, yeah.
Yeah, and something Rana pointed out, Black Palestinians exist and they're not exempt from apartheid.
Exactly.
And the flip side of that statement is the assumption that Israel is somehow less anti-Black.
Exactly.
And if you know anything about Israel's, not only the history, but present day, they hate Black people with a passion. They've had forced sterilization of Ethiopian Jews. African migrants inside of Israel are treated, I wouldn't even say second-class citizens. They have a strong disdain for Black Lives Matter movement related organizing because they see it as integrally threatening to Israel's existence, because obviously the values of Pan-Africanism are at odds with settler colonialism.
Right.
But before I go, I wanted to recommend this book called Black Star Crescent Moon by Sohail Dalatsai. And he has a chapter where he talks about how at one point in history, the use of this term terrorism was inextricably linked between Black people and Palestinians. And it came up around the same time that Black people were being criminalized, that the phrase terrorists began to rise in association with Palestinian liberation, especially around 1968. So I recommend anyone who wants to know more, check out Black Star Crescent Moon. And if you go to Mondo Weiss, which is a website that covers Palestine, I wrote a column for several years there all about the history of Black and Palestinian solidarity. Everything from political prisoners to SNCC, the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, releasing a pro-Palestine statement in like 73, 74. So I just want people to do their research, which I know is asking too much, but like you said, why is it that now these things that you never talk about is suddenly like the tool you want to use to stifle solidarity? When Israel would exterminate us in a heartbeat if they had the opportunity to. So that's, take that with a grain of salt, I guess.
No, that's good. I mean, we can. I think we can just wrap up. I greatly appreciate y'all for coming through. I know this wasn't an easy episode to put together. I know it's tough to even talk about this shit, but I think people definitely needed to hear it. I appreciate the way y'all just pull from the everyday experiences that Palestinians go through. I really think that helps ground it, because again, a lot of words get thrown around, but I think hearing like what it really is to live under it helps ground what those words truly mean. Whether it's genocide, apartheid, settler colonialism, all these, words that can get really academic sometimes and get really lost in the weeds. I really appreciate how both of y'all really just brought it down to the ground level of how people live. And we never needed to even explicitly say that the framing Israeli or Israel-Hamas war was a myth. I think just the conversation in itself, thoroughly put that to bed. And, if there's any other questions that people have, I'm sure y'all have other sources that you can refer them to. But I think we did a great job, particularly y'all two, of just laying it all out in a way that I think makes it pretty clear that, if it wasn't already clear, which it should be, but makes it even clearer, I should say, that what's happening over there is BS, and it's also not really just like happening over there. Like, it's something that's more worldwide and impacting all of us. It's not just a foreign war kind of way, and that's also another way of detaching ourselves from it.
Yeah, I mean, something we didn't get to mention, but I just want to say it in I'm gonna do a little closing remark, is that the U.S. has given over $320 billion of aid to Israel. A few weeks ago, an organization I work with, we requested from Georgia $300,000 to cover abortion services for people, because mothers are dying in Georgia who can't get abortions, and they said we don't have the money for it. A few days later, the governor of Georgia donated $10 million to the IDF. And so I just want people to think of these numbers, think of what we don't have money for, and how the U.S. is incessant on sending billions and billions of dollars. And I want to thank you, Rana, for joining us in the conversation. Ever since I met you in so-called Toronto a few years ago, it's been a pleasure to follow you online. And I mean, we talk every now and then, but not a lot. But like, I friendly stalk your Instagram and your Twitter. You're an amazing artist as well. People listening should know that Rana is a great cultural worker. I signed on to the letter, for like cultural workers and artists against apartheid. You do I think cultural work and organizing in this context is also so important. And so I know this was like a really hard conversation for you to have, because it's so personal to you. And so thank you for just even being in conversation with me and being willing to kind of sit here and talk to us.
Well, I thought it would be hard, but as soon as we started talking, like, speaking, people get it and don't. There's absolutely nothing difficult about it when you don't feel like you're having to defend yourself as a human,
Yeah.
So
yeah,
actually, it really wasn't difficult at all, and I really enjoyed talking to you guys.
Yeah, we won't be asking you to condemn yourself or anything like that. I'm sure that happens more than it's often, unfortunately. So yeah, none of that on here. But yeah, thank both of y'all for coming through. This is great.
okay. Fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them.